I was still rubbing the sting on my cheek when the lawyer closed the leather binder and looked straight at my father. The entire room froze, 40 pairs of eyes holding their breath, because nobody had ever spoken to my father the way that man did. Those witnesses weren't just bystanders. They were board members and sycophants whose loyalty was bought and paid for, ensuring Gary's outburst would stay within the walls of the Glass Kingdom, or so he thought. But at that moment, everything stopped mattering, except his one quiet question. Mr. Gary, do you actually know who legally owns that $28 million mansion you live in? My father's hand stopped mid-air, clutching his glass. He froze mid-sip. This wasn't just about the $11,600,000 penthouse he wanted me to sign over to my brother anymore. This was a reckoning. Welcome to Turning Tables Stories channel. I'm just sitting here with a fresh coffee, watching the view and thinking about those rare moments when the truth finally catches up with power. This story has that same quiet, heavy intensity. Where are you tuning in from today? And what's your favorite drink to have with a good story? Settled in? Good. Let's step back into that high-rise office. I didn't cry. Crying is a biological reaction for people who still expect something from their family. I am a crisis manager. My professional life is built on analyzing risk, mitigating damage, and balancing the books. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of a family. Every time my brother, Tyler, racked up another $1,600,000 gambling debt, I was the one who scrubbed the balance sheet. Every time my father, Gary, flirted with a corporate scandal that threatened the Glass Kingdom, I was the one who pulled the strings to make it go away. My compassion wasn't an emotion. It was a luxury they had overdrafted for years. Gary always complained the company was bleeding cash, crying about liquidity, while Tyler spent my hard-earned salary on high-stakes baccarat. So, I quietly paid the property taxes. I paid the maintenance on the $28 million family mansion under the title of family loans. I did it because Gary claimed the company was running dry on cash. I thought I was buying a seat at the table. I thought if I was useful enough, I would finally be seen as a daughter. I now realize it was just a subscription service, and I was the only one footing the bill. When you grow up as the spare, the child who is only noticed when there is a mess to clean, you develop a specific type of survival skill. It is an invisible chain. It is a prison without bars that keeps the survivor anchored to the very people who are drowning them. I had trained myself to stay silent while Tyler took the largest slice of the inheritance. I had learned to make myself invisible, so the house stayed quiet. Back then, I believed him when he said I was a phase, not a future. But standing in that Manhattan office, looking at the Central Park skyline, the heat finally left my face. The sting turned into a cold, clinical clarity. This wasn't a family breakdown. It was a bankruptcy of character. I looked at the silver pen on the table, the one my grandfather had used to sign his legacy away. My father wasn't shocked by what he had done when he slapped me. He was only shocked that I had stopped playing along. The silence in the room wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of 40 years of lies being audited in real time. I realized that my father's power was a rented dignity, and I was the one who held the deed. I didn't wait for the elevator to reach the lobby before I opened my phone. I didn't wait for the Manhattan air to cool my temper because my temper wasn't hot anymore. It was frozen. As a crisis manager, I've learned that the most effective response isn't the loudest one. It's the one that removes the oxygen from the room. I walked out of that skyscraper, past the polished glass and the silent security guards, and I didn't look back once. I didn't cry for a father who had just assaulted me. I didn't panic about a brother who wanted my home. I simply tapped the contact for my private banker. This wasn't revenge. It was a long overdue audit. When the call connected, my voice was as steady as a heart rate monitor in an empty room. Hello, David. This is Destiny. I need to update my risk profile. I am revoking my status as the personal guarantor for all credit lines associated with Gary and Tyler. Effective immediately. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence you only get when a $500,000 safety net is suddenly snatched away. David tried to be professional, but I could hear the confusion. He knew my family's version of success was built on my signature. I told him to process it as a total withdrawal of collateral. I was simply stopping the subsidized lifestyle I had been funding for years. As I hung up, I realized how they had been able to look me in the eye and call me worthless while I was paying their bills. It was the trap of normalized cruelty. When you allow someone to mistreat you for a long time, their toxicity stops being an exception and becomes their operating system. Because I had always been there to clean up the messes, Gary and Tyler had come to see my silence, not as strength, but as a lack of options. They had normalized the idea that I was a resource to be used, like electricity or water. To them, my only value was my utility. They didn't see the person, they only saw the insurance policy. They truly believed their status was a birthright, forgetting that the foundations of their glass kingdom were built on the very daughter they had just tried to discard. I signaled for a black car service, needing the private, tinted silence of a mobile office to coordinate the first strike of the liquidation. Tyler had planned a massive celebration at an exclusive rooftop lounge to toast his new $11,600,000 penthouse. I could almost see him wearing his $4,000 suit, surrounded by the kind of friends who only show up when the champagne is free. He would be reaching for his corporate card, the one I had guaranteed, to pay for a $10,000 tab of vintage crystal and Wagyu sliders. He would be wearing that same smug grin he wore in the lawyer's office, feeling like a king who had finally conquered despair. But the transaction would fail. The little magnetic strip on that card was no longer connected to my sweat and my salary. It would be declined. Not once, but twice. I could picture the flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck as the waiter politely informed him that the credit line was suspended. I could imagine the laughter of his friends turning into awkward glances. The king was about to realize that his crown was made of unsecured debt, and I had just canceled the subscription. I stepped into the waiting vehicle, the door closing with a heavy, muffled thud that sounded a lot like a final signature. The kingdom was freezing over, and I was the only one with a coat. The phone didn't stay quiet for long. Gary was never a man who accepted a no, especially from a daughter he considered a secondary asset. He launched a public relations campaign that would have been impressive if it wasn't so pathetic. Within 24 hours, the vultures were circling. He didn't call to apologize for the slap or to negotiate a settlement. Instead, he used his remaining corporate connections to leak a story that was designed to incinerate my career before I could even take my next step. He claimed I was a predator. He told anyone who would listen, and several tabloid reporters who were paid to listen, that I was engaging in elder abuse. He painted a picture of a manipulative daughter who had used her professional skills to brainwash a dying grandfather into signing over the family legacy. He used the term elder abuse like it was a tactical weapon, hoping the sheer ugliness of the accusation would force me to surrender. I watched the headlines scroll across my phone while I sat in my home office. I didn't panic. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I simply opened a new spreadsheet and began a forensic audit of my mother, Patricia's medical trust. Gary had insisted on managing her special care facility payments, claiming it was his duty as a husband. But I knew Gary. To him, duty was just another word for leverage. I looked at the premium history for her long-term care insurance. My mother has advanced, early-onset dementia. She needs round-the-clock specialized care that costs $15,000 a month. What I found was the digital equivalent of a crime scene. Gary hadn't just been late with the payments. He had stopped paying the premiums altogether 6 months ago. He had let her specialized coverage lapse. I had been sending him the money for her care every month, thinking it was a sacred fund. But the records showed where that money had actually gone. It hadn't gone to the nursing home. It had gone directly into a holding account, used to pay the interest on Tyler's latest $1,600,000 gambling debt. My father had gambled with my mother's life to protect his favorite son's reputation. I called the facility director, and her voice confirmed my worst fears. The director told me they had been trying to reach Gary for weeks. Because the insurance had lapsed and the private payments were missing, my mother was 48 hours away from being evicted, from the only place that kept her safe and comfortable. Gary was willing to let his wife be tossed into a state-funded ward just to keep Tyler's credit cards active. This was the final straw. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for the last time. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a lethal violation of trust. I realized that Gary and Tyler weren't just ungrateful. They were a biological hazard. They were parasites that would consume everything in their path, including their own blood, to maintain the illusion of their glass kingdom. I closed the laptop. The data was clear. The audit was finished. I didn't need to yell. I just needed to execute the final phase of the liquidation. I didn't try to handle this alone anymore. A crisis manager knows when to bring in the heavy artillery. I called Marcus, a specialist in forensic accounting and estate law who makes a living dismantling corporate facades. Anger wasn't the fuel I needed. I needed documentation. I needed the kind of truth that doesn't just hurt, but incarcerates. We spent 3 sleepless nights in a room that smelled like stale espresso and old paper, digging through 40 years of my father's lies. The paper trail was a map of a dying kingdom. We discovered that the $28 million mansion wasn't just gifted to me, it was held in a revocable trust my grandfather had established 13 years ago. Gary was never the owner. He was merely a tenant with a life estate, a right to reside there, but that right came with a lethal condition. He was strictly prohibited from encumbering the asset with any debt or legal liabilities. The moment he compromised the integrity of the property, his residency was forfeit. But Gary's arrogance was greater than his caution. Marcus pointed to a signature on a loan application from 2 years ago, a line of credit for $800,000. Then he showed me a copy of my own signature from a professional contract. Even to my untrained eye, the difference was clear. Gary had forged my signature on authorization forms to use the mansion as collateral for high-interest, predatory loans. He didn't just mimic my handwriting. He had exploited a corrupt, longtime family notary to bypass the bank's identity verification process, turning a professional trust into a criminal tool. He had used a property he didn't own to fund Tyler's lifestyle, gambling, that I would never be brave enough to look at the books. This was the criminal twist I needed to end this war. This wasn't just ungratefulness or family favoritism anymore. This was a felony. My father had committed systematic fraud against his own child to protect the favorite son who was currently drinking away my mother's medical premiums. Every signature Gary had faked was a nail in the coffin of his authority. He had spent decades painting me as the dramatic, ungrateful daughter while he was quietly robbing me of my inheritance and my future. The weight of the discovery felt like a lethal weapon in my hands, calm, factual, and absolutely final. I looked at the pile of forged documents and felt a strange sense of peace. The girl who had been slapped in a Manhattan office was gone. In her place was a woman who realized that family isn't a debt you pay with your life, and blood isn't a license to steal. I wasn't just an accountant for their sins anymore. I was the judge. I authorized Marcus to prepare the emergency restraining order and the criminal evidence for the district attorney. The paper reckoning was complete. Gary had built a house of cards, and I was about to remove the bottom row. I pulled up the gravel driveway of the $28 million mansion for the last time as an outsider. The house looked as grand as ever, its limestone facade glowing under the Manhattan twilight, but to me, it was just a beautiful shell covering a rotted core. It smelled like sandalwood and unpaid debts. I didn't knock. I didn't wait for a greeting. I walked through the double doors, my heels echoing against the marble like a countdown. Gary was in the dining room, the same place where he used to hold court like a king. He was leaning back in his chair, feet on the table, taking a slow sip of a $500 bottle of vintage red wine. He looked up at me with that familiar, lazy arrogance, believing he was still the architect of my life. "There you are," he said, his voice smooth and untroubled. I knew you'd come to your senses. Tyler's already looking at furniture for the penthouse. Sign the gift documents, Destiny, and we can put this unpleasantness behind us. He wasn't just asking for the deed. He was trying to force me to absorb the massive gift tax liability, effectively making me pay the IRS for the privilege of being robbed by my own family. He actually smiled at me, an expression that tried to mimic fatherly warmth, but only succeeded in showcasing his delusional entitlement. I didn't say a word. I simply walked over and set the leather folder on the table right next to his glass. He didn't even put his drink down as he flipped it open. I watched the exact moment his world tilted. He froze mid-sip as he saw the bold header of the emergency restraining order and the photocopies of his own forged signatures. The silence that followed was heavy, with 40 years of buried truth. I watched him realize that his power was never a birthright. It was a rented dignity he had been paying for with stolen funds, and my silence. My father was the ultimate example of the illusion of power. People like Gary believe that throwing money at things makes them important, but when the bank account is empty, the character is revealed as hollow. He was a man who had rented his respectability, using his father's legacy and his daughter's hard work. Now that the lease was up, he had no value left. He wasn't the chairman of a glass kingdom anymore. He was a man with a $500 wine habit and a $0 net worth. You're not the owner of this house, Gary, I said, my voice cold and clinical. You're a squatter. You violated the terms of the trust when you used this property as collateral for Tyler's $1,600,000 gambling debts. And because you laid hands on me in that office, this isn't just a civil dispute, it's an emergency criminal order of protection. In Manhattan, when there's a history of assault, the NYPD doesn't wait. They clear the premises for the victim's safety immediately. He tried to stand, his hands shaking, his face turning a blotchy red, as he realized the police were already en route to enforce the court order and escort him from the property. For the first time in my life, I watched my father struggle for words and find none. He looked small in that grand room, like a child caught playing dress-up in his father's suit. He begged me to be sensible, to think of the family name, but I was already turning my back on him. I was done being the accountant for his sins. I walked out as the sirens began to wail in the distance, leaving the king of the empty castle behind, to face the truth he'd been avoiding for decades. The legal fallout was swift and absolute. Gary and Tyler were unable to pay the $1,600,000 restitution for the forged loans and the back taxes I had stopped covering. Within weeks, the once feared chairman and his golden son were forced to sell every designer suit, every leased car, and every scrap of their rented dignity. They ended up in a cramped, drafty two-bedroom apartment in a part of the city they used to call the gutter. It was a humbling reversal of fortune, a complete dismantling of the status they worshipped, but they would survive. That was the difference between their situation and the one my mother faced. They weren't going to die, they were just going to be uncomfortable. I made a conscious choice not to pursue the full criminal charges that would have seen Gary spend his remaining years behind bars. I didn't do it out of a lingering sense of loyalty, but for my mother, Patricia. She deserved to finish her life in peace, not in the shadow of a public scandal involving her husband in a state prison. I established a private, ironclad trust for her care, ensuring she would never again have to worry about a premium being missed or an eviction notice being served. She is safe now, resting in a quiet garden facility where the air smells like lavender, and the nurses actually remember her name. As for the $28 million mansion, I didn't move back in. I didn't want to live in a mausoleum built on 40 years of favoritism and neglect. Instead, I repurposed it. I turned the cold glass kingdom into the Eleanor Refuge, a foundation dedicated to women who have suffered from family financial abuse and coercive control. By registering the mansion as a private nonprofit headquarters with an integrated residency program, I navigated the city's rigid zoning laws that would have otherwise buried a traditional shelter in red tape. The grand dining room where Gary once slapped me, is now a light-filled counseling space for those rebuilding their lives from the ashes of someone else's greed. Revenge is a fire that consumes the one who lights it, but true justice is a seed. This is the seed sower's legacy. By transforming a symbol of exclusion into a sanctuary of healing, I didn't just win a legal battle, I redefined what it means to be a daughter. The Garys of the world are eventually forgotten, because they build only for themselves. But the seedlings we plant for others become the only inheritance that truly lasts. I stood in my new office, looking out at the Manhattan skyline, and realized the silence no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a foundation. Looking back on everything, I've come to realize that family isn't a debt you are born with, and blood is never a license to steal your peace. If you've spent your life as the spare, the one who carries the burden while someone else gets the praise, remember that your worth was never determined by those who refuse to see it. Becoming the black sheep of the family often just means you are the only one brave enough to look at the glass and see the cracks. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes, it's the only way to set yourself free. If Destiny's journey helped you find the strength to build your own territory today, please share this video. Sometimes, the truth is the only key to your own front door. Follow for more stories of justice.